Ned Stark blinked sweat and tears from his eyes as dawn's early light spilled over the red mountains. In that pale gold glow, he stood at the foot of the Tower of Joy, surrounded by the fallen. 6 of his men were dead. Despite every vow he had made to protect them, each lay in the blood-soaked dust. Ser Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, stood with his great sword in both hands, breathing heavily. The man was wounded but not mortally so. Ned's friend Howland Reed knelt on one knee not far behind Ned, a shallow slice across his brow. The entire world seemed to hang on a breath of wind, silent but for the rasp of metal, the ragged gasps of men who had nearly carved each other to pieces. Arthur Dayne lowered his sword. Dawn, that peerless blade which caught the sunlight and seemed to glow, stained red at its tip. The great knight looked at Ned with an expression that was somewhere between sorrow and resolution. He was the last of the Kingsguard guarding this forlorn tower, the last champion of Prince Rhaegar's final secrets. Ned had come so far, had lost so many dear companions, only to stand here at the end with the truth just out of reach. He wanted to hate Arthur Dayne. He wanted to gather all his grief, Brandon's death, Rickard's death, the murders in King's Landing, the sacking of the city, the death of Elia and her children, and now the loss of these loyal men who had followed him into the mountains, and aim it all at this singular foe. But the man who stood before him was no monster. A great knight, yes, perhaps the greatest swordsman Ned had ever faced, but no butcher. Ned's chest rose and fell, that swirl of emotion warring within him. "Ned?" croaked Howland from behind him. Ned did not know if it was the sight of his friend's blood, or the memory of the men who lay in broken heaps on the ground, or the strange calm in Arthur Dayne's face, but something inside him cracked. The thirst for vengeance ebbed, replaced by an odd clarity. He had come seeking Lyanna, desperate to see her, to protect her if she was still alive. That was what mattered. With a heavy sigh, Ned dropped to one knee. He placed his sword in the dust and slowly lifted his gaze to Arthur Dayne. "The war is over," he said. "You fought with honor, Ser Arthur. We have spilled enough blood." The words came from him in a voice he scarcely recognized, low and rough with emotion. Arthur Dayne's breath caught, and for a moment his gray eyes flickered. He had expected a final attack, or he had prepared himself to sell his life as dearly as possible. Ned saw in the man's face the weight of his own honor, the sense of duty that had kept him here. Even with the Targaryen cause ruined, with King Aerys dead and Prince Rhaegar slain on the Trident, Ser Arthur Dayne had guarded Lyanna Stark to the end, no matter what that might mean for him. "Lord Stark," the Sword of the Morning said. His voice was soft, almost uncertain, as if uncertain how to speak to an enemy who had just thrown down his weapon. He raised Dawn, then carefully drew it back from Ned, the posture no longer that of a warrior pressing his advantage but of a man stunned by an unexpected mercy. "You would spare me?" Ned slowly rose back to his feet, dust clinging to his knee. He said, "there has been enough death. If my sister is here, let me see her. Please." The last word emerged as a plea, raw with sorrow. Arthur Dayne hesitated, his gaze flickering to Howland Reed, to the scattered bodies, to the tower itself. Ned felt that the night was balanced on a razor's edge, torn between a vow and a new sense of pity or respect. Finally, Ser Arthur inclined his head. He lowered Dawn, the tip scraping gently in the dirt, and nodded. "She is here," he said. "Come." Ned and Howland followed him into the Tower of Joy. The interior was dim compared to the bright day outside, but Ned's eyes adjusted. He heard a faint cry echoing off stone walls, a cry that set his heart to pounding. Lyanna's voice. He would know it anywhere, even after so many months apart. He broke into a half-run, leaving Arthur Dayne behind, and rushed up the spiral steps toward the upper chambers. He found her in a small, cramped bedchamber. The walls were stone, the single window narrow and high. At the center stood a bed, and upon it lay Lyanna Stark, the wolf maid of Winterfell, as pale as the snow of her homeland. She had a sheen of sweat on her brow. Her hair clung to her cheeks, and the smell of blood was strong in the room. Her breathing was ragged, painfully weak. A wash basin sat on a small table near the bed, a cloth draped across it. A meager arrangement of supplies indicated that someone had attempted to tend her. "Lyanna," Ned breathed, falling to his knees by her side. He took her hand, shocked by how cold it felt. Her face was drawn, yet when she turned to look at him, her gray eyes brightened with recognition. The ghost of a smile touched her lips, the same smile that used to shine so brightly in Winterfell's courtyard when they were children. "Ned." Her voice was no more than a whisper. "Ned, you came." Ned leaned closer, choking back tears. "I'm here, Lya. Gods, I'm here. We found you." His voice broke, and he pressed her hand to his cheek. She gave a small, labored laugh that turned into a rattling cough. "They wouldn't let you come sooner," she said, eyes flickering. "I told them to, Arthur." He listened, "but the others, I?" He shook his head and squeezed her hand, gently. "Don't speak of that. It doesn't matter now. We'll get you home. You'll be safe." He clung to that promise, as if by saying it he could make it true. Her gaze swept over him, and she tried to lift her other hand, but it trembled before she managed to place it atop his. "I'm dying, Ned," she said quietly. "I can feel it." He shook his head fiercely, tears in his eyes. No, we'll send for the best maester. Someone from Old Town. Someone with the knowledge." "Shoo," she whispered, as though trying to soothe a frightened child. Promise me you'll protect him." Ned's heart hammered in confusion. He looked around the room and, for the first time, noticed the small bundle in a cradle made of woven straw by the bedside. It was covered with a thin cloth, and from that bundle came the soft whimper of a newborn. Ned stared, mind racing. Lyanna had a child. Rhaegar's child. His sister's gray eyes were wide and pleading. "Promise me?" she repeated, wincing at a spasm of pain. Her breath was shallow, but her voice steadied for a moment. "Robert, if he finds out, he will kill the boy. The war, it doesn't matter. Targaryen or not, the child is my son. Ned, he's my son. Protect him, please." Ned found he could scarcely draw breath. He managed to nod. "I promise," he said, his voice catching. "I swear it, Lya. On my life and my honor. I swear." She exhaled in relief, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "His name? Name him Aegon or Jaehaerys or—" A fresh wave of pain twisted across her face. "I can't decide. His father, he wanted a Visenya once. But this is a boy." Ned cupped her cheek, tears sliding down his face. He soothed her gently, though his heart was near bursting with sorrow. "We'll find him a good name," he whispered. She shuddered, her breath coming in uneven gasps. "A good name," she murmured. "He's a good boy. He has my blood and Rhaegar's. Keep him safe, Ned." "I will," he said. "I will. Just rest." Before he could finish, her last breath caught in her throat, and she stilled. Lyanna Stark's eyes stared sightlessly. Ned closed them with trembling fingers. For a time, he could not move. It felt as if every part of him had turned to stone. At last, he drew a shaking breath and looked to the cradle. The baby was awake, looking around with wide, curious eyes that shimmered in the candlelight. Ned reached over and gently lifted the child. The boy was so tiny, so fragile. Yet there was a quiet strength about him, dark tufts of hair on his head, fair skin, a small, slightly upturned nose. Tears streamed down Ned's cheeks again, tears of grief for Lyanna, for his fallen men, for the end of all the hopes the rebellion had carried. And yet, holding this child, he felt a swell of fierce protectiveness. He had sworn an oath to Lyanna, and he would keep it no matter the cost. Behind him, at the door, stood Arthur Dayne. The knight had followed up the stairs. His face was drawn, his lips pressed tight with sadness or regret. He looked from Lyanna's still form to Ned, who cradled the infant. "I did what I could," Arthur said, voice subdued. "She was too weak. The child was born too soon, I think. Rhaegar's orders. He told me this child would be the prince that was promised, that everything hinged on him. Even if I did not fully understand, I tried to honor my prince's last command. And your sister's wishes. Ned swallowed. His sorrow was too raw for resentment, for blame. She's gone, was all he could say, voice choked. But the child lives. Rhaegar's son. Arthur nodded slowly. Yes, he said. He stepped into the room. What will you do with him? Ned thought of Robert, the new king of the Seven Kingdoms, triumphant in his rebellion. He thought of how Robert's hatred for all Targaryens flared like a fever, how he had once vowed to destroy every dragon root in Westeros to ensure no scion of House Targaryen could ever rise again. If Robert knows the truth, he will kill the boy, Ned said, voice shaking. The knight's face tightened, but there was acceptance there. He will. Robert Baratheon will not spare him. Ned looked down at the infant. The child squirmed, then settled, letting out a small sigh. For an instant, Ned recalled all the times he and Lyanna had played in Winterfell's Godswood, the love they had shared. He had made a promise, and Ned Stark's promises were as firm as the granite walls of the north. I must keep his parentage secret, Ned said. I must raise him as my own bastard, for no safer way exists. Robert could never countenance the idea that Rhaegar left a living heir. Arthur Dayne pursed his lips, sorrow darkening his gaze. He is the rightful prince of the blood, he said, as if reciting something he had believed all his life. But then he caught sight of Lyanna's limp hand on the bed, and in his eyes Ned sensed a powerful conflict. I have my honor, the knight said at last softly. But if keeping him alive requires that the world believe him a bastard, so be it. Ned exhaled, some tension leaving him. He was not sure how he had expected Arthur Dayne to respond, but a part of him had feared the man would try to claim the child and flee across the narrow sea, or fight Ned for the boy's guardianship. Yet that was not the case. Ser Arthur had seen the cost of this war, the ruin left behind, and perhaps realized that duty to the living child was more important than any shattered cause. Still cradling the baby, Ned stood. He must never be discovered, he said. I'll have to say his mother was some peasant girl in Dorne, or in the Vale, or I haven't decided, but I'll guard his life with my own. He swallowed and glanced back to Howland Reed, who had come up behind them and was staring somberly at Lyanna's body. The Crannogman's face was shadowed with grief. He and Ned exchanged wordless understanding. Ser Arthur Dayne looked to the sword he still held, and slowly he sheathed on. The blade's pale surface was etched with faint ripples of steel in the lamplight. If you will permit me, I would help you bury your sister, he said, voice low. I owe her that much, and your men too. I spilled their blood. It is only right that I lend a hand in caring for their remains. Ned's throat felt tight. If not for his own oath, and for the child, he might have turned Arthur Dayne away or demanded the man's head. But everything was changed now. There was no point in vengeance, in continuing a cycle of hatred. His sister had died, but her child lived, and Ned would not sow more destruction on that fresh grave. Very well, he said. I'll need your help. They carried the bodies out into the crisp morning. The mountains loomed overhead, silent witnesses to the swirl of war that had at last drifted past them. Ned gathered stones and laid out the men of the north in a row, faces turned to the sky. He whispered their names as he worked. Willem, Ethan, Martin, Theo, Mark, and Jory's cousin Ethan Glover, all fallen in the fight. Dayne helped gather their swords and placed them on the cairns with respect. Then they lifted Lyanna, wrapped gently in a linen shroud, and placed her on a bier of stones as well. Ned hovered over her body, the tears dried to salt tracks on his cheeks. He repeated a prayer to the old gods in a hushed voice, though the wind here carried none of the chill breezes of the north. Arthur Dayne murmured something under his breath, likely his own prayer to the seven, and the two men, one a Stark, the other a Dayne, found themselves bound for a moment by the combined grief and guilt of this war. At last, they turned to the question of how to proceed. Ned held the baby, who squirmed, beginning to fuss. Dayne hesitated, then reached into a saddlebag he had left near the tower's entrance, and withdrew a small flask of goat's milk. likely part of the supplies he had been using for the newborn. Ned realized with a pang that these Kingsguard had known they might die here, yet they had tried to prepare. Arthur Dayne took a small rag, dipped it in the milk, and allowed the child to suckle. "You must name him," Dayne said, looking at Ned with an odd gentleness. "Whatever Rhaegar might have wanted, your sister must have told you something." Ned recalled Lyanna's half-delirious words. A swirl of Targaryen names: Aegon, Jaehaerys, Aemon. But there was no sense in that now. Keeping him safe required burying those names. "Jon," Ned said at last, thinking of Jon Arryn, who had fostered him in the Vale, who had taught him the meaning of honor. The child was Rhaegar's heir, but more importantly, he was Lyanna's son, and Ned had to conceal his lineage. "His name is Jon." Felt right. Howland Reed nodded silently, as if approving. Arthur Dayne lingered a moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded as well. "Jon Snow," Ned said softly, testing the name he would give the child as a bastard. "We'll say he's my bastard, born in the South, of a woman I met during the war." Arthur Dayne's expression flickered. Perhaps he was reliving Rhaegar's hopes, or mourning the baby's loss of his true name. But the knight did not protest. "So it shall be," he said. Ned, cradling the newborn Jon in the crook of his arm, watched the rising sun slowly crest the mountains. The Tower of Joy loomed behind them, empty now. Duty, that was all Ned knew anymore. The realm was ravaged, the Targaryen dynasty destroyed except for the exiled Prince Viserys and Princess Daenerys rumored to have fled. Robert was king. A new order was rising, and Ned had to ensure that in that new order this boy survived. But before any of that, he faced another immediate question. What would become of Arthur Dayne? "I cannot let you return to King's Landing," Ned said quietly. "Your presence would draw suspicion. Robert would demand your head." Dayne nodded, his jaw set. "I have no place in that court, nor do I wish for revenge." He cast another glance at Lyanna's shrouded form. "My sister Ashera is at Starfall. I would see her again, and I suppose this sword belongs to House Dayne. Dawn is not mine to carry any longer if I have no cause, no king to serve." Ned studied the man's face. "Sir Arthur, if you go to Starfall now, rumors could spread. People might wonder why the Sword of the Morning rides back after so many months. Alone. They might question the circumstances of my sister's death. The secret of Jon's parentage could leak." Dayne frowned. "It might," he admitted. "But what can I do? If I vanish, never to be seen again, it will create questions of its own. Let the realm believe I died with the rest at the Tower of Joy. I do not wish to be remembered, Lord Stark, but I must return Dawn to its ancestral seat." Ned understood. The man was as bound to duty as Ned himself. Returning Dawn was as sacred as the vow that had brought Dayne to guard Lyanna. "Very well," Ned sighed. "We can let the realm believe Sir Arthur Dayne was slain. The truth need not be told. But if you do ride for Starfall, I beg you, spread no rumors of this child." Dayne inclined his head. "You have my word. I will tell no one the truth of Prince Rhaegar's heir. And for your sister's sake, I hope the boy lives a quiet, safe life." Howland stepped closer, placing a hand on Ned's shoulder. "We should go, my lord," he said softly. "Too many eyes might come searching, with the war ended and your sister unaccounted for. They'll look for you. We must return home." Ned nodded. He felt the weight of his responsibilities settling on him like a cloak of ice. He handed the child momentarily to Howland so that he could gather his horse and check the saddlebags. He looked around at the cairns at Lyanna's resting place. One day, he thought, he would bring her bones north to lay her with her ancestors in the crypts of Winterfell. But for now, her cairn would stand here, in the mountains that had been her prison, but also the last place she had loved. He turned to Arthur Dayne for a final word, but the knight simply extended his hand, palm up. In it lay a small ring, Lyanna's ring. "She asked me to keep it safe," Dayne said, "but it belongs with you, Lord Stark." Ned took the ring. It was a simple silver band inlaid with a pattern of blue roses. The sight of it broke his heart anew. "Thank you," he managed, No more words were spoken. Arthur Dayne raised his hood over his head, mounted his horse, and set off westward toward Starfall. Ned watched him go, reflecting on how strange life could be, that a day earlier he had believed he would be forced to kill the man, that both of them would likely perish, yet now he stood with a child in his arms, forging a new path. At last, Ned mounted his own horse, Howland behind him with another mount. John was wrapped snugly in a swaddling cloth. They rode eastward into the dawn, carrying with them the last secret of Lyanna Stark. They traveled with all the haste they could manage. Out of Dorne, across the scorching deserts and rocky passes, hugging the main roads just enough to find water and supplies but skirting large towns. Ned was Lord Stark of Winterfell, hero of the rebellion, friend and brother-in-arms to the new king, but he could not risk questions about the child. He told no one of Lyanna's fate. Whenever they reached a village, Ned said only that the boy was his own, and that he had found the mother there in Dorne. The folk gave him sidelong glances, but to their knowledge, there was nothing unbelievable about a soldier fathering a child out of wedlock during a war. It happened often enough. The journey was long, and grief seemed to ride with him at all hours. At night, as they set up small camps beneath the open sky, Ned would stare into the coals of the fire and think of Lyanna's dying plea, the desperate hush of her voice. "Promise me," she had said. His heart ached, but John needed him, and that was reason enough to press on. Howland was a quiet companion, each day more certain of their plan and each day more resolved never to speak of what he had seen at the Tower of Joy. Ned trusted him absolutely. The Crannogman had always been a loyal friend, and if guilt gnawed at Ned for deceiving King Robert, well, it was better to live with that guilt than see an innocent child murdered. By the time they reached the Riverlands, autumn had begun to press in, the air turning crisp. Camped near the Red Fork, Ned looked at the child in his arms, sleeping so peacefully. He felt a swell of affection. The baby had begun to coo and occasionally smile. Ned thought he saw some echo of Lyanna in those features, though the hair was dark as a crow's wing, much like Rhaegar's. He steeled himself. Soon he would stand before Robert, the newly crowned king, and he would have to present this child as his bastard. He knew Robert might rage at the idea, but it was better than the truth. They rode into the outskirts of the Crownlands and saw the devastation of the war. Burned farms, fields stripped of crops, rotted corpses of horses and men in ditches. Ned's gut twisted. So much death, for what? So that the Dragon King could be toppled, replaced by a stag. Yet if the realm found peace, perhaps it would be worth it. At last, Ned parted ways with Howland near Harrenhal. The Crannogman had to return to Greywater Watch, to his people. They said their farewells with warmth, grasping forearms. "I'll be at your side whenever you have need of me, my lord," Howland said. "But the fewer who know of this secret, the safer your sister's boy is." "I," Ned agreed. "Thank you, Howland. I could not have done this without you." They embraced, and then Howland Reed rode south and west, vanishing into the marshes, while Ned pressed on alone. When Ned arrived in King's Landing, the city was still reeling from the sack by Tywin Lannister's forces. Bodies had been cleared, but the stench of blood and smoke lingered in the narrow streets. Robert Baratheon held court in the Red Keep, wearing the crown of the Seven Kingdoms. It was an uneasy rule. The Lannisters had shown their support too late for Robert's liking, but their might was undeniable. Jon Arryn, the new hand of the king, greeted Ned with open arms. "Ned," Jon Arryn said warmly, though his face was lined with weariness, "it does my heart good to see you return safely, though I had hoped you'd bring your sister with you." Ned swallowed, feeling the weight of the secret pressing on his heart. "She died in childbirth," he said softly, refusing to meet Jon Arryn's eyes. "Her child, this boy, is mine." There he had spoken the lie. He had rehearsed it in his head, but it still tasted bitter on his tongue. "He is my bastard, born in the south of a woman I met on the journey. She died as well." Jon Arryn's brow furrowed in gentle concern. "I am sorry, Ned," he said, and laid a hand on Ned's shoulder. "I know you loved your sister dearly, As for the boy, your sense of duty is admirable. Robert may raise an eyebrow, but I believe he will accept it. He has his own share of bastards, if rumor is to be believed, though none recognized. Ned forced a tight smile. I will not fail this child, my lord. He is innocent of all else. John Arryn nodded and ushered Ned into the Red Keep. Servants took Ned's horse, and Ned carried John in his arms, the baby gazing at the world with wide eyes. Robert was seated on the Iron Throne, looking every inch the warrior king. His broad chest and muscled arms were sheathed in a red doublet embroidered with the crowned stag, and a short golden cloak draped over his shoulder. A thick black beard framed his face, and though he broke into a grin at the sight of Ned, there was a certain darkness behind his eyes, loss, perhaps, or the memory of betrayal by those who had once been friends. Ned! Robert bellowed, standing from the throne. Gods, it's good to see you, old friend. He stormed down the dais and pulled Ned into a rough embrace, not even noticing the baby until Ned almost stumbled. Where is Lyanna? Did you find her? For a moment, Ned could not speak. He simply met Robert's gaze, and that was answer enough. No, Robert said, voice cracking with heartbreak. No, my sweet Lyanna? She died, Ned said quietly. He dared not elaborate. Robert's face twisted, tears burning in his eyes. Damn them all, the king growled, turning away and clenching his fists. Damn them all to the 7 hells. First Rhaegar, then Aerys. They robbed me of everything. I never even got to see her, hold her. By the gods. Ned's heart went out to Robert, for all that he disliked Robert's single-minded hatred of the Targaryens. He had loved Lyanna in his own way. Let him mourn. After a moment, Robert turned back, his gaze falling on the baby, his brow knit. And, you have a babe with you? Ned breathed, forcing himself to speak steadily. He is mine, born as a result of the war. The mother was a camp follower. He could barely force the words out, the lie stinging him. She died as well. I will raise him as Jon Snow. Robert's face contorted with confusion and perhaps a hint of shock. Then he let out a bark of laughter, though it was an empty sound, devoid of true mirth. By the gods, Ned, I never thought you of all people. Well, war is war. Blood and lust go hand in hand, or so they say. He shook his head. You plan to take the child home with you? To the north? Yes, Ned said. He is my blood, and I will not abandon him. Robert studied him for a moment. Ha! If anyone else told me that story, I'd wonder what else was hidden behind it. But you, Ned, you've always been the loyal sort, the honorable sort. I'll let it be. In time, you'll find a wife, have your trueborn children. But this boy, well, at least you're owning up to him. He clapped Ned on the shoulder. I'm sorry about Lyanna. Truly. If the Targaryen babes had not already been slaughtered, I'd hunt them down myself. This war, it took everything from me. Ned held his tongue, thinking of the baby in his arms and the secret of his parentage. Robert's hatred burned as hot as ever. If he suspected for even a moment that the child Ned carried was Rhaegar's son rather than Ned's, the boy would die. Ned smiled thinly, adjusting his grip on the infant. You are king now, he said, and the realm has peace. Perhaps that is the best we can do. Robert nodded. Aye, we shall build anew. There will be a feast tonight to celebrate your return, though it'll be a smaller affair. Tywin is urging me to wed his daughter Cersei as soon as can be arranged. Perhaps you heard? The alliance with the Lannisters is crucial. Ned dipped his head. I understand. Thus did Ned remain in King's Landing a fortnight more, forced by courtesy and by Robert's requests. He tried to keep Jon Snow out of sight, leaving the babe in the care of one of the castle's wet nurses whenever duty required Ned's presence at official receptions or the small council. Whispers circulated. Ned Stark had fathered a bastard in Dorne. That was the rumor. Some looked askance at him, but few dared challenge the new king's close friend. Cersei Lannister arrived to court shortly thereafter, radiant in her golden hair and green eyes. Ned saw the calculating glances between her father, Tywin, and King Robert. The betrothal was swiftly announced, to the cheers of the court, though Robert was half drunk and half melancholy. Ned wanted nothing more than to return to the north. Every day that Jon was here felt perilous. Finally, the day arrived for Ned to depart. He approached the throne room once more, the baby strapped against his chest in a sling. Jon Arryn embraced Ned in farewell, expressing again his condolences for Lyanna. Robert embraced him too, though the king's eyes were distant, as if haunted by the memory of Ned's sister. Then Ned left King's Landing behind, taking the King's Road north. The journey north was quieter in some ways, more lonesome, but at every inn and holdfast, Ned drew stares for the baby he carried. Jon had grown a bit, producing soft gurgles of curiosity. Ned always politely deflected questions about the mother, insisting she was no longer alive. The watchers would nod solemnly, and Ned would continue on. When at last he crossed the neck and rode into the familiar hills and pine forests near Moat Cailin, Ned felt his heart tighten. He was coming home to Winterfell, but the circumstances were so changed. His father, Lord Rickard, had been murdered by the Mad King. His older brother Brandon had died, too. His sister was gone, newly entombed far away. Of House Stark's children, only Ned and his younger siblings, Benjen and the baby Rickon. No, wait, Rickon had not yet been born. He corrected himself. Only Ned, Benjen, and Brandon's betrothed, Catelyn Tully, who had become Ned's own betrothed after Brandon's death. He realized with a pang that he had not written to her in months. Would Cat accept this child? What questions would she have? He had dreaded this moment, but he had no choice. Jon would be raised as a bastard of House Stark, as Ned's son, and it was best that everyone in Winterfell understand that from the start. He tried to steel himself for the confrontation that would inevitably come. He hoped for the best, that she would understand or at least endure it. Winterfell came into view one late afternoon. The tall gray walls, the watchtowers, the great keep. It was all as he remembered, yet it felt half-emptied, as if the heart of it had been stripped away by war and loss. Guards at the gate recognized him and called out in surprise and joy. Ned dismounted, baby in his arms, and was quickly surrounded by well-wishers and retainers, men who had served his father and now bowed to him, calling him Lord Stark. Their gazes flickered with curiosity to the infant, but Ned gave no explanation. Benjen rushed out, tall and lean in his black and gray leathers, face alight with relief. "Ned!" he cried, pulling his older brother into a tight embrace. "You've been gone so long. I feared the worst. Have you heard? Father, Brandon. We lost them both." His voice cracked with pain. Ned nodded, tears threatening once more. "I know. I'm sorry, Benjen. The war took so much, but we have a new king now, and a measure of peace." Benjen's gaze fell on the baby. "Whose child?" He began hesitantly, not quite believing the implication. Ned forced himself to speak plainly. "He is mine. His name is Jon Snow." Benjen looked taken aback, and something in his face flickered from confusion to understanding. "A bastard," he murmured. Ned could see the condemnation behind his younger brother's eyes, not directed at Ned, but at the cruel reality of war that had upended their lives. But Benjen said nothing else, merely offered a faint nod. "We'll talk later. Cat is inside." That made Ned's heart pound. He braced himself and followed Benjen into the courtyard. Servants hurried to take Ned's saddlebags, and stable hands led his horse away. He climbed the steps to the great keep, each footstep heavier than the last. At the entrance to the hall, Catelyn Tully stood in a simple yet elegant gown of Tully blue, her red hair pinned behind her head. She was beautiful, but her expression was taut with worry. When she saw Ned, relief lit her face. She hurried forward, arms outstretched to greet him. "Ned," she said softly, though her eyes flickered in confusion at the child in his arms. "You've returned at last. I grieve with you for your father and brother. My father has told me so much." She stopped, staring at Jon. The baby wriggled and let out a small cry, as if aware of the tension. "Whose child is this?" Kat asked, brow furrowing. Ned swallowed. He could not meet her gaze. "He is mine," he said. "I fathered him during the war. His name is Jon Snow." Silence. He felt her shock and her hurt like a physical blow. She had pledged herself to House Stark, first to Brandon, then to Ned after Brandon's death. She had expected to arrive in Winterfell a bride, to become the lady of this castle and mother of its future heirs. Now, she stood confronted by a living symbol of Ned's supposed infidelity, even if it had happened before their marriage. "Oh," was all she could manage at first. She stood there, eyes watering, mouth parted. I see." He took a step closer, wanting to comfort her but unable to relinquish the child. "Kat," he said in a hushed tone. "I'm sorry. I never meant. The mother is gone, died in childbirth. The child is mine to care for, my blood. I could not abandon him." She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. Of course not," she said, trembling. "Of course. I understand." But her voice quavered, and Ned could see how pained she was. Despite everything, he could not tell her the truth. He had sworn a vow that overshadowed even his marriage vows. Kat deserved honesty, but the realm demanded secrecy. That night, Ned tried to soothe her as best he could. She remained composed, though there was a distance in her eyes. He saw how she avoided looking at baby Jon. The rest of Winterfell's inhabitants went about their tasks, whispering about Lord Stark's bastard. Some were kind, others merely curious, but all recognized that this was a direct complication for Ned's upcoming nuptials. Despite the tension, Ned carried on with the responsibilities of Lord Stark. He oversaw the castle, assigned tasks to the stewards, consulted with Maester Luwin about the approaching winter stores. In every decision, the memory of his father and brother loomed. Ricard's strong leadership, Brandon's fiery passion, both gone. Now the weight rested on Ned. He struggled to live up to their memory, to do his duty by the North. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, the shock of Ned's return with a bastard child faded into the daily routine of Winterfell. Catelyn went about her duties as the soon-to-be Lady of Winterfell. She was cordial, even affectionate with Ned in public, but he sensed a barrier between them in private. At night, when Jon cried, Ned would rise to tend him, letting Kat sleep. He tried to shield her from the baby's presence as much as possible, but it was an imperfect solution. A household found ways to revolve around an infant, and Kat could not help but be reminded that this boy, who was not hers, would grow up alongside her own future children. Benjen avoided speaking of it, though once or twice Ned caught a flash of resentment in his younger brother's eyes. Whether it was resentment for Ned fathering a child while on campaign, or simply for the tragedy that had befallen House Stark, Ned could not say. But one evening, in the Godswood, Ned stood before the heart tree, holding Jon. The old weirwood's face, carved centuries ago, stared at them with red, sap-filled eyes. Ned felt that the gods themselves bore witness to his vow. He kissed Jon's brow and murmured, "I promised your mother I would protect you. My honor is yours, little one." He heard soft footsteps behind him, turned, and found Catelyn standing there with a cloak wrapped around her shoulders. She looked uncertain, as though she had debated whether to approach. "Ned," she said quietly. "May I?" She gestured to the baby. Ned exhaled, relief and caution mingling. He stepped forward, letting her see Jon's small face. The baby looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. Catelyn managed a thin smile, though sadness lingered. She reached out and brushed a gentle fingertip across Jon's cheek. "He's so small," she said. Ned agreed softly. "He is." She took a breath. "Our wedding is in a fortnight," she said. "Your lords and bannermen will gather. I suppose the boy will be at the feast as well in some corner or other." Her tone was not cruel, simply resigned. I have been trying to accept that he will be part of our household." Ned bowed his head. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know this is not what you expected." She studied him, I know you grieve for your father, your brother, your sister. This child, you want to do right by him. And that is the man I married or will marry soon. Honorable Ned Stark, who cannot turn away a child he fathered. I just wish it did not weigh so heavily on my heart." Tears brimmed in her eyes. She brushed them away, forcing a small, sad smile. "But I will do my duty by you, my lord. By the North. I pray we find some happiness." Ned reached out to gently touch her cheek, baby John safe in his other arm. "I vow to you, Cat, I will be a good husband, and this boy will never threaten your children's place or name. He is a bastard, nothing more. I only ask that you let him live under our roof." She closed her eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Yes, you have my word." Ned realized how deeply he admired her strength in that moment, her grace under such painful circumstances. He leaned in and kissed her brow. For the first time since his return, they felt a fragile closeness. He turned back to the heart tree. The red eyes stared impassively, witnessing everything. Ned silently prayed for guidance, for forgiveness for the lie he must carry. If the gods heard him, they did not speak. The wedding took place at the foot of the heart tree a fortnight later. Representatives from the great houses of the North came. House Manderley from White Harbor, House Bolton of the Dreadfort, House Umber, House Glover, House Serwyn, and many more. They gathered in the godswood, wreathed in autumn leaves that glowed red and gold in the crisp air. A hush fell as Ned, dressed in gray and white, stood across from Catelyn, who wore a pale blue cloak embroidered with silver fish along the hem. The ceremony was a modest one, as they had lost their lord and heir in the war, but there was still a certain solemn beauty in it. Maester Luwin presided alongside the customary Septon's presence for Catelyn's faith. They bound their hands with a ribbon, sealing their union before the old gods and the new. Ned felt the warmth of Kat's hand in his, saw the glimmer of tears in her eyes, and knew that, despite everything, they would do their best to make a life together. Jon Snow was not part of the ceremony, of course. He remained in the care of a wet nurse, but Ned noticed the covert stares from many of his bannermen and guests, who whispered about the new Lord Stark's bastard. He did not let it sour the day. Let them whisper. The North had more pressing concerns. Winter was always on the horizon, and the realm needed stability. Afterward, feasting commenced in the Great Hall. Long tables groaned with roast boar, venison, trout, and bread. Flagon after flagon of ale was poured, and men laughed, raised toasts, and flung jests across the room. The mood felt somewhat forced, as if they were all trying to banish the ghosts of the recent war and the memories of the Mad King's horrors. But Ned appreciated the moment of communal cheer. His people needed hope. Catelyn sat at his side, receiving the well wishes of the lords of the North. She smiled, though it did not always reach her eyes. Ned did his best to offer her small kindnesses, a gentle squeeze of her hand or an encouraging glance. Eventually, when the hour grew late and the feast grew loud with drunken revelers, Ned escorted her to the bedchamber that had been prepared for them. Their words were few, but they shared a somber, sincere moment of closeness that night, consummating the marriage, forging a fragile bond of trust amidst the swirling uncertainties of House Stark's future. Time passed in Winterfell. The first snows of that northern autumn dusted the battlements, though they melted quickly in the day's sun. Ned found himself settling into the role of Lord Stark, seeing to his bannermen's needs, arbitrating disputes, ensuring the granaries were stocked. Catelyn performed her duties as the Lady of Winterfell with grace, overseeing the household, guiding the seamstresses, planning for the colder months. She also wrote letters to her father, Lord Hoster Tully, keeping him informed of events in the north. Jon Snow grew quickly as infants do, from a fragile newborn to a sturdy baby who started to crawl across the floor. Ned found himself smiling or often around the child, though that joy was tinged with sorrowful memory of Lyanna. The baby had her spirit, he liked to think, hidden behind those bright eyes. Catelyn was polite to Jon when they crossed paths, but Ned could see the pang of hurt that flickered each time she saw him. Still, she did not mistreat the boy, nor did she forbid him from the household's daily life. For that, Ned was grateful. Winterfell had traditions for acknowledging new additions to the castle. When a child of the Lord was born, there were naming ceremonies, blessings in the godswood. But Jon was a bastard, so these customs did not strictly apply. Still, Ned carried him often to the heart tree, as if wanting the old gods to watch over the child. It became a habit. At dawn or dusk, Ned would walk the silent paths of the godswood, speaking softly to Jon, showing him the reflection pool, the carved faces, the ancient moss. One day, as Ned was returning from a council with his stewards, he happened upon Benjen sparring with Roderick Castle in the courtyard. Wooden swords clacked. Benjen, quick and agile, darted about. When he spotted Ned, he lowered his practice sword and offered a short bow. Ser Roderick bowed as well, stepping aside. Benjen, breathing heavily, approached. "Brother," he said, "you've not been sparring lately. We used to train together." Ned nodded, handing Jon to a passing servant for a moment so the baby wouldn't be too close to the flying wooden swords. "I have had many tasks. You're still set on joining the Night's Watch." The rumor had reached him that Benjen was considering it. Benjen exhaled. "After what happened to our father and brother, it seems like a place I can find some purpose." He looked away, eyes distant. "And I feel I no longer belong here, not in the same way. You are Lord Stark now. Soon enough you'll have a trueborn heir with Catelyn. The castle is in good hands. But I want to do my part for the realm." Ned studied him. He knew the Watch was a noble calling, though its ranks had diminished in recent decades, and the world seemed to have forgotten the old threats in the far north. But if Benjen felt drawn to that life, Ned would not stand in his way. "If that is what you wish," Ned said gently, "I will support your decision, but wait until spring. The journey to the wall is harsh in winter." Benjen inclined his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you," he said. "Perhaps I'll wait." He glanced over at the servant holding Jon. "He's growing quickly, isn't he?" Ned's lips curved into a fatherly smile. "He is," he agreed. "He'll be walking before long." Benjen hesitated. "Will you raise him as your heir if—" He trailed off, the unspoken question lingering. If Catelyn bore no children, or if something else happened, would Jon become heir to Winterfell? Ned's eyes hardened just a fraction. "He is a bastard," he said quietly. "The North does not suffer bastards to inherit, not without royal decree. And that is not something I would do. Catelyn's children will be my heirs." Benjen nodded, expression conflicted. "Good," he said. "I only wondered. Some lords, they might blur that line." Ned frowned. "I have no intention of doing so. Jon is my blood, and I will give him every courtesy I can, but I cannot pass Winterfell to him. That would bring chaos to the line of succession, and the realm has had enough strife." They parted then, each lost in their own thoughts. The next turning point came when King Robert and Queen Cersei announced a royal progress north, several moons after Ned's wedding. Word reached Ned by Raven. The king wished to see his old friend, and perhaps hunt in the Wolf's Wood. The letter was filled with a boisterous tone, typical of Robert, but Ned sensed tension behind the words. The realm was still recovering from war, and Robert's hold on the throne depended in part on demonstrating his power and forging alliances. Visiting the North might be as much about stamping his authority as it was about seeing Ned. Winterfell bustled with preparations for the royal visit. Catelyn organized every detail, from lavish feasts to new bedchambers readied in the Great Keep. Banners were sewn, floors scrubbed, roads cleared. Ned oversaw the garrison and the huntsmen. They awaited the king's party with no small measure of apprehension, for the expense alone would be considerable. When Robert arrived with his retinue, the courtyard was filled with golden Lannister guardsmen, the Baratheon standard, and an array of highborn courtiers. Cersei Lannister dismounted in a swirl of green velvet, her golden hair shining. Her eyes swept the castle with mild disdain. Robert, in contrast, roared in delight upon seeing Ned, embracing him with enough force to rock him back on his heels. "I've missed you, Stark." Robert declared. "We've too many lickspittles in King's Landing. Gods, it's good to breathe clean air." He inhaled dramatically, then let out a hearty laugh. Ned smiled politely and introduced Robert to his lady wife, Caitlin. Robert offered a polite kiss to her hand, but his gaze wandered quickly. "You're a beauty, my lady," he said, though it lacked the passion he had once reserved for Lyanna. Cersei stood nearby, her expression cool and unreadable. They filed into the great hall, where a feast awaited. Cersei walked arm in arm with Robert, but he kept glancing over his shoulder at Ned, peppering him with questions about hunts in the region. Once seated, the king devoured roast venison and downed ale after ale. Conversation flowed about the wars, about Tywin Lannister's regency of the West, about peace treaties with Dorne. Ned stayed quiet, uneasy. He feared that at some point, Robert's curiosity would turn to Jon Snow. Sure enough, near the end of the feast, the king, half drunk, slapped Ned on the back and said, "So where is that bastard of yours? The boy. I hear you've been coddling him like a true father." A hush fell around them. Caitlin tensed at Ned's side. Ned's jaw tightened, but he forced a calm nod. "Jon Snow," he said evenly. "He's just a babe yet, Robert. He's Abed in the nursery. Perhaps you will meet him on the morrow." Robert laughed uproariously, but there was a slightly mocking edge in his voice. "I recall your shock at my fathering bastards in the war camps. Look at you now. The quiet wolf, indeed. Ah well, no matter. At least the mother is out of sight." Ned's stomach churned. He could not bring himself to reply. He saw the flicker of amusement cross Cersei's face, a cat-like smile that did not reach her eyes. The rest of the hall resumed their chatter, though a few heads still turned to watch the king's boisterous jests. Later, after the feast, Ned guided Robert to the rooms prepared for him. On the way, Robert paused and caught Ned's arm. "I'm sorry," he said, suddenly subdued. "I only meant to jest, but I'm well in my cups. I remember your words that day, when you told me Lyanna was gone. Sometimes I think if I had just arrived sooner, if I had taken her from Rhaegar." He trailed off, face red not just from drink but from simmering regrets. Ned placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. "It's done," he said gently. "We can only move forward. You have a new queen now, and the realm needs you." Robert nodded, looking weary. "Yes, the realm. I'll do my duty as you do yours." He shook his head and lumbered into his chambers. Ned exhaled slowly, feeling the presence of the old gods beyond the window, the cold wind of the north swirling in the corridor. He prayed Robert would not pry further into Jon's heritage. The king and queen stayed a fortnight. Robert hunted, drank, and boasted, while Cersei displayed polite indifference. She did meet Jon Snow once, a fleeting occasion in which Ned carried the boy into the courtyard as the queen was passing by. She paused, her gaze flicking over the child. "A bastard," she said quietly, lips curling. "Your northern sense of honor is almost quaint, Lord Stark. I trust the mother is nowhere near." Ned stiffened but bowed. "She is not, your grace," he said, voice neutral. Cersei's green eyes narrowed, as though searching his face for secrets. Then she simply swept away, her golden hair catching the sun. Ned clutched Jon closer, heart hammering. That woman's scrutiny was dangerous. Thankfully, the progress soon moved on, heading west to the next major seat, and Winterfell settled back into its normal rhythms. Ned felt relief wash over him once the king's party had vanished over the horizon. He cradled Jon that evening by the hearth, telling the child softly, "We have endured one danger. There will be others, but I will keep you safe." The baby cooed, unaware of the threats that lurked in men's hearts. Caitlin seemed relieved as well by the departure of the king and queen. The next month saw her become pregnant, a blessing to House Stark. Maester Luwin confirmed it in the second moon of the new year. Ned felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Joy that he would have a trueborn heir, guilt for the deception that overshadowed everything, fear for the future. He tried not to let it show. The pregnancy progressed well, and in time, Caitlin gave birth to a son, Robb Stark, named in honor of Robert, though Ned was sure Robert would never be told that in so many words. The entire castle celebrated. A new heir for Winterfell. A fresh start for House Stark after so much tragedy. Ned felt genuine affection for Robb, a sense of wonder at the child's existence. He still doted on Jon Snow, of course, but was careful not to overshadow Kat's joy with reminders of the bastard. As the years rolled on, the two boys grew side by side, Robb the recognized heir, and Jon the quiet, watchful child who shared the same hallways and courtyards. Catelyn was never cruel to Jon, but a certain distance remained. Servants whispered that the Lady of Winterfell could not quite love the boy. Yet to Ned's satisfaction, Jon developed a close bond with Robb, as if they were littermates in a pack, an unspoken connection that overcame the differences of birth. They would play in the yard, chasing each other on stubby legs, shrieking with laughter. Ned watched them with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Jon did not know the truth of his parentage, nor did he suspect it. He was just a boy, but Ned saw glimpses. The determined line of his mouth, the fierce glint in his gray eyes, a reflection of Lyanna's stubborn spirit. Ned prayed the secret would never come out, that Robert would never suspect. Arthur Dayne had vanished into history, rumored dead, and the Targaryen name was all but eradicated in Westeros. Only whispers of Viserys and Daenerys remained, supposedly living across the narrow sea. Yet fate is a wheel, forever turning, and the secrets of the past rarely remain buried forever. On a crisp evening, several years after Jon Snow's birth, a message arrived at Winterfell, borne by a weary rider. Came from Starfall in Dorne. Ned opened the scroll in private, his heart pounding the moment he recognized the sigil, the falling star of House Dayne. The letter was brief and unsigned, but Ned guessed at its author. It read simply, "The sword has returned to its place, but its guardian wonders if the promise is kept. The morning star endures. Should a day come when old vows are called, remember the dawn." Ned's hand shook. Arthur Dayne was alive. As they had agreed, he would remain hidden, letting the realm think him dead. He had returned to Starfall with Dawn. For him to send a letter now, was he testing if Ned had kept the child safe? Or was it some cryptic warning that forces in Dorne still suspected something? Ned swallowed thickly. He burned the letter in the hearth. The memory of Arthur Dayne's last words came flooding back. He had promised to keep Jon's identity hidden, but there was no telling what might happen if others discovered the truth. Doran Martell still ruled Dorne, quietly nursing old grievances after the deaths of Elia Martell and her children. If he knew Rhaegar's son lived, who could say how that might reshape the realm? Fear lanced through Ned, and he stared into the flames, remembering Lyanna's dying wish. "I have kept my promise," he murmured to the dancing embers. "I will always keep it." Outside, in the courtyard, Jon Snow and Robb Stark raced each other. Their laughter echoed, unburdened and free. A handful of guards and servants smiled at the sight, and Rickon, the newest addition to the family, for Catelyn had borne a third son after Bran, clapped his tiny hands in delight. Bran, the middle child, toddled near them, wanting to join. Ned watched from a window, the hush of old regrets warring with the warm glow of fatherly pride. The realm might be precarious, but for this moment, here at Winterfell, peace held. He only prayed that day would not come when the secret came crashing down upon them all. Yet somewhere under the same sky, Arthur Dayne in Starfall likely pondered the same. And somewhere across the sea, Viserys Targaryen raged in exile, dreaming of reclaiming what he believed was his birthright. Daenerys Targaryen grew beneath an eastern sun, innocent of the grudges that had shaped her family's downfall. The future was unwritten. The tide of destiny swelled like a gathering storm. But in Winterfell, for now, Ned Stark stood resolute. He had spared Arthur Dayne, forging an unspoken alliance of silence. He had carried Lyanna's son home and named him Jon Snow, weaving a lie that preserved the boy's life. The Tower of Joy still cast its long shadow, but Ned refused to let it darken this fragile peace any more than it must. Honor and love demanded sacrifices, and Ned Stark bore them in silence, holding that precious secret in his heart. The secret that might, one day, change the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. The seasons turned in the north, slow and certain as the passage of the sun. Within the gray walls of Winterfell, life settled into a rhythm that both soothed and worried Ned Stark. He had spared Ser Arthur Dayne at the Tower of Joy, brought Lyanna's child home, and passed him off as his own bastard. Jon Snow, dark-haired and gray-eyed, grew up in the shadow of Robb Stark, the trueborn heir, sharing childhood games and lessons. The older they got, the more people remarked on how alike they looked in some ways, though the difference of birth hung like a faint cloud in the Great Hall. A bastard never quite belonged. Ned watched the two boys chase each other across the courtyard. Robb was laughing, and Jon's face glowed with delight. He was nearly the same height as Robb now, leaner but quick on his feet. Already the training yard beckoned to them. Even at 6 years old, they gravitated to swords of wood and makeshift shields, as if they could sense the shape of their future. Bran toddled after them, only 4 years old, full of eagerness, while Rickon, still a babe in the cradle, fussed in the arms of a wet nurse. Sansa and Arya were yet to be born, but Ned could almost sense them waiting in the wings of fate. He prayed the girls would be spared the heavier burdens that so often befell the Starks of Winterfell. Catelyn had settled into her role as Lady Stark, though it was clear she still carried a distant ache. Despite her best efforts, she struggled to view Jon Snow with anything more than measured politeness. She did not mistreat him. Ned would never have tolerated that, but she could not embrace him as she did Robb or Bran. Ned saw it in the way she guided her own children with warmth and gentle humor, while her tone with Jon was always formal. Perhaps it was her Tully upbringing, or perhaps she just could not forget that the boy represented, to her mind, Ned's single great failing of fidelity. The truth, that Jon was Lyanna's child and Rhaegar Targaryen's, remained locked in Ned's heart. Sometimes he wondered if he was doing the right thing by never confiding in his wife. But his promise to Lyanna was unbreakable. The fewer who knew, the better. Winter settled thick and cold, painting the battlements white. The children played in the snowdrifts, throwing snowballs and laughing until their voices echoed through the courtyard. The walls of Winterfell, warmed by the hot springs beneath, never allowed the keep to freeze. It remained a bastion against the howling winds. Ned took comfort in the continuity of it all, this fortress that had sheltered the Starks for thousands of years. Yet not all was peaceful. Rumors flitted in from the south. King Robert reigned in King's Landing, squandering coin on feasts and tournaments, pressing lords to pledge fealty after the rebellion that had seated him on the Iron Throne. There were hints of tensions in the royal marriage. Queen Cersei had birthed a son, Joffrey, and a daughter, Myrcella, and was pregnant again. But gossip said the king and queen were rarely together. Tywin Lannister, the king's father-in-law, maintained a vigilant influence on the court. Jon Arryn served as Hand of the King, quietly keeping the realm's accounts from plunging into chaos. Ned had corresponded with Lord Arryn now and then, short letters of courtesy and updates on the north, but he refused to be drawn back south unless absolutely necessary. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Ned and Catelyn sat in the solar, a small fire crackling in the hearth. The wind outside moaned around the stone walls, and a hush fell between them. Ned studied his wife's face in the firelight. She looked tired, perhaps from chasing little Bran throughout the day. At length, she turned to him and said, "I had a letter from my father. He wonders why we do not visit Riverrun so that Robb might know his Tully kin. He speaks of a betrothal in time. There are families eager for alliances, even with so young a lord." Ned set his cup of mulled wine aside. "He is only 6, he said gently, "but I understand Lord Hoster's desire to see his grandson." Catelyn nodded. "We could wait another year or two, but we should go eventually. The boys are old enough to ride, if we take the King's Road slowly. Perhaps we could bring them all, even Jon, if you think it best." Her tone cooled slightly at the last words, but she did not flinch from them. Ned paused. He knew the idea of traveling with Jon made her uneasy. "It might be easier," he said carefully, "if I take Robb and perhaps you take Bran or remain behind with him until he's older. We don't want the entire household on the road. Not in winter." She seemed relieved by his suggestion. Yes, that might be wise, she said. I suppose. The bastard can stay here if you'd rather not parade him about. She caught herself, remembering how the word bastard grated on Ned. John, she amended, but her forced courtesy only sharpened Ned's regret. We'll decide in the spring, Ned said quietly. There's no rush. That night, he slept fitfully, dreaming of the Tower of Joy. In his mind's eye, he saw Lyanna lying pale and still, her hand cold in his, her voice echoing, "Promise me." Then Arthur Dayne stood in the shadows, dawn gleaming with faint light, silent and sorrowful. Ned woke at dawn with a start, the bedchamber chilled despite the fire on the hearth. He dressed and went to the godswood, as he often did, to kneel before the heart tree. Red eyes, carved in ancient white wood, watched him without blinking. He prayed for guidance, for the strength to protect John, for the wisdom to lead the north well. The heart tree gave no reply. By the time he returned to the castle proper, the sun had risen. In the courtyard, Ser Roderick Castle was already drilling with young squires. Roderick, gray of hair and stern of countenance, had once trained Brandon Stark in swordplay. Now he oversaw the next generation. Ned spotted John and Robb standing off to the side, each holding a practice S. Word that looked too big for them. John clutched his carefully, eyes intent on the older boys. Robb, restless, was already swinging his. Ned approached. "You're up early," he said, ruffling Robb's auburn hair. "Ready to train?" Robb grinned, his cheeks rosy in the cold. "Yes, father." John looked up, uncertain whether to call Ned father in public. He usually did not, for Caitlyn's sake and to avoid confusion among the servants. He simply said, "I want to learn the sword as well, my lord." His voice wavered slightly. John was 6, maybe near 7, old enough to notice the difference in how people addressed him versus how they addressed Robb. Ned looked down at the boy. He saw so much of Lyanna in those eyes. "Of course," he said softly. "Ser Roderick, can you make time for both my sons?" Ser Roderick nodded gravely. "Aye, my lord. They'll start with the wooden swords, footwork, the basics. It's never too early to learn how to stand properly." Robb let out a whoop of delight, brandishing his practice sword. John simply inclined his head, solemn. Ned squeezed John's shoulder before stepping back. He overheard Ser Roderick explaining footwork to them. Stand balanced, knees slightly bent, keep your eyes on the opponent's chest. Even at 6, Robb took to it eagerly, though he had a tendency to overreach. John, quieter, seemed to soak up every word, trying to mirror Ser Roderick's stance precisely. That small scene of 2 boys learning the sword might have seemed ordinary, but for Ned, it was laden with meaning. He thought of how Arthur Dayne had been called the greatest swordsman of his generation, how Rhaegar had believed in prophecy, how Lyanna's life had ended far too soon. In that moment, watching John, Ned prayed the boy would never be forced to fight in a war for a crown that was his by blood, blood the world must never know about. The day progressed as usual. Ned held counsel with Maester Luwin about the accounts, spoke with his master-at-arms regarding new recruits, and sent a letter to Jon Arryn with updates on the north. The routine steadied him. Duty kept his mind from drifting too far into regret. But that night, a raven arrived bearing news of trouble on the Iron Islands. Balon Greyjoy had started to grumble about independence. Rumors suggested he might rebel. Ned read the letter twice, then showed it to Caitlyn. "He won't dare," she said in a clipped tone. "Robert's beaten him once before." But Ned looked at her and said, "This would be the first time since Robert's rebellion that a great lord openly defies the crown, if it comes to that. And the Ironborn have never been easy to tame." Caitlyn nodded gravely. "Then we must be ready to answer the king's call if it comes." She glanced across the room, where Robb was playing with a carved wooden direwolf. John sat nearby, quietly flipping through a book of stories. "You'll have to lead the northern banners if the king demands it," she murmured, worry creeping into her tone. "I don't want to see you leave again." He squeezed her hand. "I pray it won't come to that, but we are sworn to the crown. If there's rebellion, Robert will put it down quickly." He did not add that Robert might request Ned's presence specifically, for if the king marched himself, he would want his old friend at his side. Word came the following month that Balon Greyjoy had indeed declared himself king of the Isles, rebelling against the Iron Throne. Preparations were swift. Robert Baratheon called his loyal lords to arms. Ned received a personal raven from the king, requesting that he lead the northern forces to join with the royal host. Catelyn's face grew pale when she heard. "War again," she whispered. "Not so soon after the last." Ned tried to soothe her. "I will take an army, but it won't be like the rebellion against Ares. This will be smaller, I promise. The Ironborn can't match the combined might of the Seven Kingdoms." Catelyn pressed her lips together. "At least the children are safe here. What of Jon Snow?" That was the first time in a while she had mentioned him directly, without a trace of coldness. It was more worry for Ned's sake than for Jon's, but still it surprised him. "I'll leave him here as well," Ned said. "They're both too young to follow me to war, whether Robb is trueborn or not. Benjen plans to accompany me if he can, but he still speaks of eventually taking the Black. Perhaps after this campaign, he'll ride to the Wall." They parted ways with a lingering sense of foreboding. Ned gathered loyal bannermen. House Umber, House Glover, House Mormont, House Bolton, House Serwyn, and others. Thousands of northern soldiers marched south and west to join the main host under King Robert. The campaign proved swift and brutal. The Royal Navy, along with ships from the Reach and the Westerlands, blockaded the Iron Islands, while Robert and his bannermen laid waste to rebel strongholds on the coast. Ned fought at Seaguard, leading a contingent of Northmen. Lord Jason Mallister greeted him warmly, but the fighting was fierce. Ironborn raiders harried the shoreline with a savagery that reminded Ned of the darkest days of the rebellion. Yet the royal forces were overwhelming, and soon Pike itself was under siege. Ned climbed the jagged rocks of Pike's outer fortifications, clashing with Ironborn axemen. The salt wind stung his face. The sea raged below, waves crashing against the cliffs. King Robert himself led the final assault on the gates, warhammer in hand. The thunder of his voice echoed as he roared for Balon Greyjoy to show himself. Balon's eldest surviving son, a youth named Roderick, died in the fighting, and the second son, Meryn, perished when a tower collapsed into the sea. Only Theon Greyjoy survived, a boy of about 10. When Balon at last surrendered, Robert showed no mercy. He demanded that Theon be taken hostage and raised by the Starks of Winterfell, Ned's ward. It was to ensure Balon's future loyalty. With a grim expression, Ned accepted the charge. "He will be treated well," Ned promised, "but he will never forget that the wolves can bare their teeth if the krakens rise again." Robert clapped Ned on the shoulder, leaving the boy in his care. Theon, ashen-faced, eyes glittering with hatred and grief, rode north with Ned when the campaign ended. The war lasted less than a year, but it scarred the Iron Islands. Ned took no pleasure in subjugating them, but duty demanded it. When Ned returned to Winterfell, the courtyard was thick with fresh snow. Catelyn greeted him, relieved. Robb and Jon, now 7, rushed out to see him. Both had grown taller. Robb jumped into Ned's arms, exclaiming about the battles he had heard rumors of. Jon hung back, looking uncertain. But Ned ruffled Jon's hair just the same, smiling softly. "I'm glad to see you both," he said, letting his affection shine through. Then Theon Greyjoy stepped forward. Thin, angular, his hair a sandy brown, his eyes sharp with sullen resentment. He was only 10, yet he tried to hide his fear behind a swaggering stance. Ned introduced him to his household, stating that Theon would be his ward, raised alongside Robb and Jon. Catelyn put on a polite face, though Ned sensed her discomfort. She saw Theon as a hostage, a reminder of the violence in the south and west. "Welcome to Winterfell," she said carefully, though Theon did not quite meet her eyes. Time marched on. Theon, Robb, and Jon formed an uneasy companionship, as boys often do when thrust into proximity. They sparred together, hunted rabbits in the nearby woods, practiced archery in the courtyard. Theon was the oldest, self-assured but sometimes cruel with his jests. Robb had an easy confidence and the knowledge that Winterfell would one day be his. Jon was quieter, watchful, prone to pushing himself harder than anyone else in training. All the while, Ned kept an eye on them. He taught them honor as best he could, reminding them to take no joy in brutality, to treat the small folk with respect. Catelyn had 2 more children by then, Sansa and Arya, 2 girls as different as moonlight and firelight. Sansa was all courtesy and sweet smiles, eager to learn sewing and the courtesies of a lady. Arya was restless, more drawn to swordplay and rough games, tagging along behind Robb and Jon whenever she could. Jon often included Arya out of kindness, while Theon teased her about her messy hair and tomboy habits. Arya's quick temper flared, and once, she threatened Theon with a stick, leading to a chase through the corridors. Ned had to intervene, half amused. He saw in Arya the same fierce spark he remembered from Lyanna. In those days, as the children grew, Winterfell seemed almost idyllic. The war with the Ironborn had ended swiftly, Robert's rule appeared secure, and rumors of exiled Targaryens across the narrow sea faded into the background of southern gossip. Yet Ned never forgot the letter Arthur Dayne had once sent from Starfall, that brief, cryptic message about the sword returning home and old vows. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he worried about the future. Could Arthur Dayne remain content in obscurity? What if, one day, the truth emerged? But the years slipped by with no sign of Dayne. The North endured. Ned's children grew. Young Rickon was a toddler with a will of iron. Then, the day came when King Robert arrived at Winterfell again, bearing an offer that would change the course of House Stark's fate forever. It was a brisk morning when horns announced the royal procession. Banners snapped in the wind. The crowned stag of Baratheon, the lion of Lannister, and smaller sigils for an array of lords and knights. The courtyard of Winterfell filled with fine horses and carriages. Ned, with Catelyn at his side, stood at the gates to greet the king and queen. Behind them, the Stark children lined up, eyes wide with excitement or trepidation. Jon lingered at the edge, uncertain whether to stand with his siblings or hang back. Ned gently gestured for him to join them. King Robert dismounted heavily. He had grown even larger around the waist, and his face was florid. Queen Cersei stepped down from her carriage with regal grace, her golden hair gleaming in the wan light. Behind them came a retinue of highborn courtiers, among them a tall man with broad shoulders and pale hair, Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer. There was also a small, sharp-eyed man with mismatched green and gray clothing, Lord Peter Baelish, the rumor said, and a knight of the Kingsguard with a white cloak trailing behind him. Ned felt his stomach clench as he spotted those white cloaks, recalling that day in the mountains at the Tower of Joy. Of course, none of these knights were Arthur Dayne, but the memory lingered. Robert embraced Ned, booming, "Ned, my old friend. Gods, it's been too long. Are these all your children? I've lost count of how many Starks now roam these halls." Ned introduced Robb, Sansa, Arya, and Bran with quiet pride. Then he nodded toward Jon, who bowed his head politely. Robert's gaze lingered on Jon for only a moment, curiosity flickering. "Ah, yes, the bastard," the king said, not unkindly. "Good, strong lad. Get him in the training yard. I like the look of him. A bit of the wolf in that one. Eh." Ned tensed, but forced a small smile. "He trains with Robb and the others," he said. "He's quite skilled for his age." Inside, Ned's heart twisted at the casual way Robert dismissed the boy's presence. Never knowing Jon was not Ned's bastard at all, but Rhaegar's son. He wondered what Robert would do if he learned the truth. Murder in an instant, likely. The knowledge made Ned's blood run cold. Robert pivoted to greet Catelyn with a jovial kiss to her hand, then gazed around at the castle. "Still cold as the grave here," he said. "Let's get inside, have a warm meal, and talk. I've a proposition for you, Ned. I've told no one else yet." Ned swallowed, guiding Robert and Cersei into the great hall. Servants hurried to arrange a feast. The children were herded away by septas and tutors, though Arya tried to linger near the king's party, only to be ushered out by her mother. Ned settled Robert at the high table, with Cersei at his right and himself at his left. The other lords and knights found seats, and soon the hall was loud with the clatter of plates, the smells of roasted meats, and the hum of conversation. After cups of strong ale and a few hearty bites, Robert leaned toward Ned, grinning. "I'll not mince words. Jon Arryn is dead." Ned froze. "Dead? But I had no word. How did he die?" "A fever," Robert said, his voice dropping. "We're not entirely sure." Came on swiftly. He was investigating something, acting strangely near the end. "My wife's father, Tywin, thinks it was an accident of nature. The maesters say it was a sudden illness. But enough of that. I need a new hand, Ned, and I want you." Ned's stomach plunged. Hand of the king? That post would drag him south, into the Viper's nest of King's Landing, among Lannisters and Southern lords. He would be forced to bring his children, or at least some of them, leaving Winterfell in uncertain hands. He recalled the war, the tension, the secrets he must keep. Yet Robert was his friend, his king, and Jon Arryn had been like a father to him. "My lord," Ned said carefully, "I am honored, but the North—" Robert waved a hand dismissively. "The North can manage. You have bannermen who can oversee matters in your stead. You'll want to take your family, see the realm. Besides, I've another reason." He glanced at Cersei, who smiled thinly. "We'd like to forge a marriage alliance. Your daughter Sansa is a beauty, yes? She is near Joffrey's age. Think of it, Ned. A Stark wedding a Baratheon, uniting the North and the Crown for good." Ned's eyes drifted to Cersei. Her expression remained unreadable, but he sensed satisfaction beneath the surface. Could it be that the Queen wanted Sansa to be Joffrey's betrothed? Or was this Robert's idea alone? "My daughter is but a girl of 10, he managed. "I had not yet considered betrothals." "She's old enough to be betrothed," Robert said. "They can marry in a few years. It happens all the time among highborn families. Come, Ned, say yes. You've served me well before. I need your counsel now more than ever." Ned's thoughts spun. The idea of being hand of the king alarmed him. King's Landing was a pit of intrigue, and his secret about Jon. He would be bringing the boy into the dragon's den, so to speak, where the slightest slip could expose him to deadly danger. Then again, perhaps Jon would remain in Winterfell, but that would mean parting from him, or having to explain to the realm's greatest lords why Ned's bastard was in the capital with him. He risked so much, yet he knew Robert would not be easily dissuaded. "I will think on it," Ned said quietly, reluctant to give a hasty answer. Robert accepted that with a grunt, turning back to his ale. Cersei's green eyes flicked between them, calm as a cat's. Later that evening, after the feast, Ned walked the battlements with Catelyn, the wind biting at their cheeks. He told her of Robert's offer, and the mention of Sansa's potential betrothal. Catelyn's immediate reaction was concern, but also a sense of duty. "A royal match is a great honor," she said, "and if it secures the North, but King's Landing can be dangerous. For you, for us all." Ned nodded grimly. "I need to consider the ramifications. If I refuse him outright, I risk insulting the king. If I accept, I drag our family into the heart of the realm's politics." Catelyn drew the cloak tighter around her shoulders. "We cannot hide from the realm forever. You are the second most powerful lord in Westeros after the king. It seems inevitable that you would be called to his side." Ned looked out at the snow-covered courtyard, the flickering torches on the walls, the lonely silhouettes of winter trees. "I suppose so," he murmured. "And there's something else. Jon Arryn was investigating something before he died. Why would the hand of the king take ill so suddenly? Robert implied there might be more to it." Catelyn's brow furrowed. "You think he was murdered?" "I don't know," Ned said, "but it troubles me. Jon Arryn was an honorable man, a second father to me and Robert both. If he truly discovered something that threatened powerful people in the capital, it's possible someone arranged his demise. Going south could be stepping into a net." They stood there in pensive silence. Eventually, Ned closed his eyes and said, "I'll do my duty. I'll accept. I cannot abandon Robert. He was Lyanna's betrothed once and my friend. He fought beside me to end the Mad King's tyranny. I owe him this much." Catelyn nodded, resting her hand on his arm. "Then we will go. Winterfell will endure under your castellan's guidance, with the help of your bannermen." She paused. "What of Jon Snow?" Ned exhaled the question he had dreaded. "If I take him south, questions will arise. If I leave him here, he may feel abandoned. But perhaps it is safer for him here in Winterfell. With Robert and the Lannisters near, we can't risk them noticing anything unusual." She gazed at him. "I agree. Best if he stays here. He is old enough to understand that you have duties in the south, and I can endure his presence." She said it almost apologetically, as if she recognized her own limitations. "I will do my best, Ned." He touched her cheek gently. "Thank you, Cat." The morning came when the royal party planned to depart, but not before Robert demanded Ned's answer. In the great hall, assembled courtiers and lords of the north gathered. Robert sat at the high seat, looking slightly impatient, with Cersei at his side. Ned stood before them, flanked by Catelyn, Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and behind them, Jon Snow and Theon Greyjoy. The courtiers whispered at the sight. All these children, all these potential alliances. Joffrey, the crown prince, preened near his mother, already taking after her haughty demeanor. Next to him, his siblings Myrcella and Tommen looked less certain, glancing around at the unfamiliar surroundings. Ned knelt before the throne-like chair they had placed for Robert. "Your Grace, you do me great honor in asking me to serve as Hand of the King. I pledge I will accept your offer, if you still wish it." Robert broke into a wide grin, heaving himself to his feet. "Of course I wish it. Rise, Lord Eddard Stark, Hand of the King." A smattering of applause arose from the assembled lords, though Cersei merely tapped her gloved hands together twice, expression cool. Ned stood, face impassive. Already, he felt the weight of 1,000 responsibilities settling onto his shoulders. Robert grabbed his arm in a friendly, if somewhat possessive, gesture. "We will travel south together, you and I. Bring as many of your household as you please. We'll celebrate in every town from here to King's Landing." Ned forced a polite smile, though he had no desire for lavish celebrations. "Very well, Your Grace." Over the next several days, Catelyn made hurried arrangements. Sansa was to accompany them, for Robert insisted on finalizing the betrothal between her and Joffrey. Arya demanded to go as well. She was enthralled by the idea of seeing the capital, and Ned thought it might be a valuable experience for her. Robb, as Ned's heir, would remain to keep Winterfell's presence strong in the north, a responsibility that both he and his mother agreed upon. Bran was still young, but he so dearly wanted to see the great cities. In the end, Ned decided to bring him too, thinking the journey might broaden his horizons. Rickon, only a toddler, would stay with Catelyn until a future date. Jon Snow, he decided firmly, would remain behind as well. That decision brought a tense farewell on the morning. The royal procession left. Ned found Jon in the courtyard, gazing at the baggage carts and the gathering horses. The boy's face was tight, as if he was wrestling with disappointment. He saw Sansa and Arya eagerly hugging each other, giddy with the prospect of traveling. Bran stood nearby, bouncing on his heels. Robb was stoic, having accepted that he would remain behind to train and learn to govern. Jon alone wore the look of someone left out. "I won't be coming, will I?" Jon asked as Ned approached. His voice was low, careful. Ned knelt so that he could speak softly. "Not this time, Jon. I need you here to help Robb look after Winterfell. The North remembers, and we must have enough capable hands in the castle." Jon's jaw tightened. "You mean because I'm a bastard, it's easier if I stay?" Ned felt a pang in his heart. "It's not about that," he lied gently. "If I could, I would bring you, but Robert's court is complicated. You'll be safer here." Jon swallowed. "But can I serve you better in King's Landing? Maybe as a squire." Ned set a hand on his shoulder. "Not this time. There will be a day, I promise, when you will find your place, your calling. But for now, I ask you to trust me. Serve this house in the north with Rob. Learn from Ser Roderick, from Maester Luwin." There was so much Ned wanted to say. That he loved Jon as a son, that the secrets of King's Landing might devour him if anyone suspected his true parentage, that Robert's hatred for Targaryens still burned in his heart. But Ned could not voice any of it. Jon, ever observant, read something in Ned's eyes, uncertainty, concern, and nodded stiffly. "Yes, my lord." Ned pulled him close, surprising Jon with a brief, fierce embrace. "Take care of your brothers, Jon," he murmured. "Winter is coming." Jon returned the hug with awkward fervor, then stepped back, eyes glistening. Ned rose, feeling that old ache in his chest. He saw Catelyn a short distance away, watching, her face unreadable. He hoped she would at least treat Jon fairly in his absence. The thought of leaving the boy behind with no fatherly figure tugged at Ned, but there was no alternative. And so the royal procession departed Winterfell. Catelyn and Robb stood at the gates to bid them farewell. Robb was tall for his age, leaning on a practice sword. Theon hovered near him, making some quip that Robb only half listened to. Jon lingered by the stables, fists curled at his sides, saying nothing. Ned caught his eye one last time, mustering a small nod of encouragement, before spurring his horse forward. Arya and Sansa rode in a cart behind the king's party, while Bran sat astride a pony. The road stretched out southward, and Ned felt a looming sense of destiny he could not name. King's Landing, when they arrived after weeks on the King's Road, was a cacophony of noise and smells. Arya looked around with wide eyes, enthralled by the bustling crowds, the cramped streets, and the towering red keep on Aegon's high hill. Sansa was more focused on the royal court's splendor. The gold-trimmed banners, the richly dressed lords and ladies, the graceful spires of the great September brand tried to take it all in, excitement shining in his young face. Ned, however, felt only dread. The capital was in a restless state. Rumors of intrigues drifted through every hallway. The king's small council welcomed Ned politely enough. Pycelle, the Grand Maester. Varys, the Master of Whisperers, who smiled like a spider. Peter Baelish, Master of Coin, full of sly humor. Renly Baratheon, Master of Laws, who wore a green doublet in the style of Highgarden and had a charming smile that reminded Ned vaguely of a younger Robert. None of them mentioned Jon Arryn's demise except in the most general terms. A great tragedy, a sudden illness. Ned moved into the Tower of the Hand with his children, along with a modest entourage of northern guards. Each day, he presided over matters of the realm, hearing petitions, issuing commands in Robert's name when the king was too busy or too drunk. He discovered quickly that the crown was deep in debt, owed mostly to House Lannister. He read over accounts with frustration, seeing how Robert spent coin on lavish tournaments and feasts. The city watch seemed ill-funded. The roads were full of bandits. And behind it all, Ned felt the swirl of hidden alliances. Lord Baelish dropped hints of conspiracies in the shadows, while Varys whispered of exiled Targaryens across the sea, a beggar prince named Viserys and his sister Daenerys. Daenerys was said to be young, just entering womanhood. Some rumors claimed that the Magister Illyrio Mopatis in Pentos was arranging a marriage for her with a Dothraki warlord. Ned remembered how Robert had sworn to kill any Targaryen that appeared in Westeros, no matter how young or innocent. The vow had nearly driven a wedge between them after the sack of King's Landing. Yet Rhaegar's trueborn children had been murdered by Lannister men. Only Viserys and Daenerys had survived, spirited away. Ned listened with a heavy heart, thinking of Jon Snow. If Robert ever found out that the boy was Rhaegar's son, no bastardy in the world would stay his hand. He would see the boy butchered. The horror of it kept Ned restless at night. Meanwhile, Sansa was introduced at court as a potential future queen for Joffrey. She was thrilled at the prospect, having devoured songs and stories about handsome princes. Joffrey, for his part, seemed courteous at first, though Ned found his smile shallow. Arya loathed the superficiality of the court and often snuck away to watch sword training or amuse herself with the stable boys. Bran, bright-eyed, roamed the castle corridors, wanting to see every corner of the Red Keep. Ned tried to keep them all safe, but he knew King's Landing was no place for children to roam freely. One day, amid the swirl of royal duties, a raven arrived from Winterfell. The seal bore the dire wolf of House Stark, but the handwriting within was Catelyn's. Ned's heart sped up as he broke the seal, reading her hurried words. Jon has been asking questions about his mother. He found an old letter in your study, references to Lya that might have confused him. I have tried to steer him away, but he is insistent. He wants to know who she was, where she came from, why you have never spoken her name. He overheard some servants gossiping that you bedded a fisherman's daughter in the south. I have told him you would explain one day, but that he must be patient. I do not know how long I can keep him from prying. Ned's knuckles whitened on the parchment. Jon's curiosity was natural. What boy wouldn't wonder about his mother? But the actual truth was far more dangerous. Ned had always dreaded the day Jon asked in earnest. He had hoped that day would be far in the future. But the boy was nearly 10 now, old enough to read between lines and sense adult evasions. Ned felt guilt gnaw at him. He penned a careful reply, urging Catelyn to reassure Jon that his mother was of no noble birth, that Ned had promised not to speak her name out of respect for her memory. A half-truth to justify the secrecy. It stung him to write it, but there was no other way. The real mother was Lyanna Stark, Jon's own aunt by law, and fathered by Rhaegar Targaryen, the greatest threat to Robert's rule. If that secret escaped, it would mean death for Jon. Ned sealed the letter with trembling hands, praying that Jon would not push further. Time crawled in King's Landing. Ned found more clues suggesting Jon Arryn's death was no mere accident. He heard that the late hand had visited blacksmiths in Flea Bottom, searching out a certain apprentice with dark hair and purple eyes. The rumors stirred Ned's wariness. Targaryen features? Or perhaps it was just gossip. Yet something about it made Ned uneasy. Varys, with his soft voice and watchful manner, kept dropping cryptic hints about how knowledge was a weapon, and how poison was a woman's weapon. Indeed, the tears of Lys could mimic the symptoms of a sudden fever. Ned questioned the king's justice. If someone murdered Jon Arryn, they might be close to Robert, close to the Lannisters. He recalled how Tywin Lannister had sacked King's Landing, how the Lannisters had taken the Targaryen babes from their mother and butchered them. Could some scheme be unfolding again, targeting potential Targaryen threats? The more he thought about it, the more the walls seemed to close in. Sansa, meanwhile, grew ever more infatuated with the idea of marrying Prince Joffrey. She told Ned about Joffrey's compliments, how gallant he was, how he was going to give her a golden necklace. Ned tried to caution her gently that real life was not like the songs, that men like Joffrey could wear masks. But she simply blushed and insisted he was wonderful. Arya, more cynical, told Ned that Joffrey was a lying little weasel, which earned her a scolding from Septa Mordane. Ned saw glimmers of truth in Arya's words, but he kept his worries to himself. He had bigger concerns: the realm's finances, the question of Jon Arryn's death, and the precarious secret of Jon Snow. One evening, while alone in the Tower of the Hand, Ned heard a soft knock at the door. He opened it to find Peter Baelish, leaning on the frame with a smirk. "Lord Stark," Baelish said smoothly. "I wonder if I might have a word in private?" Ned disliked Baelish's sly manner, but he let him in. Baelish strolled about the solar, idly glancing at maps and ledgers. "You've been investigating the late Jon Arryn's comings and goings," he began. "I'm sure you've discovered some interesting tidbits." Ned watched him warily. "I have discovered that Lord Arryn was concerned about the royal children, among other matters." Baelish raised an eyebrow. If I might be so bold, I'd advise caution. Some secrets can be quite deadly, especially those involving the Queen's personal affairs. Jon Arryn was, how shall I say, not blind. He saw things most men did not wish to see." Ned frowned, annoyance flickering across his face. "Say plainly what you mean, Lord Baelish. I have no taste for riddles." Baelish gave a languid shrug. Very well. It is known that the queen has a fondness for her brother. Some might call it more than brotherly. And the royal children, well, let us just say that black hair does tend to run strongly in Baratheon bloodlines. Yet Joffrey's hair is golden as the sun. The room seemed to tilt around Ned. He had read accounts in the book of lineages Jon Arryn had left behind, noticing a pattern. Every Baratheon child for hundreds of years had dark hair, except these. You mean to suggest that Prince Joffrey is not Robert's son? That the Queen's children? Baelish flicked a hand dismissively. I suggest nothing, my lord. I merely point out that Lord Arryn was deeply troubled by certain genealogical anomalies, and not long after he uncovered them, he died. Coincidence, perhaps. Ned felt a cold sweat. If Joffrey was not Robert's son, then the boy was no true heir to the Iron Throne. That would mean the entire succession was in question. Why tell me this? Baelish's smirk widened. Because I've always had a fondness for Catelyn's family. Consider it a favor. You might find it prudent to keep your head low if you intend to delve deeper. The king's wrath is one thing, but the queen's vengeance is another. And her father, Tywin Lannister, is not a man to cross lightly. Ned stared at the man, mind whirling. So Jon Arryn might have been killed because he discovered the truth of the royal children's parentage. This was an immense secret, one that could plunge the realm into chaos if revealed. He recalled Robert's burning hatred for Targaryens, how he had fought a war to dethrone them. If he discovered that his own heirs were false, fathered by Jaime Lannister, Ned's voice, when he found it, was harsh. If this is all true, Robert must be told. Baelish sighed. Ah, the Honorable Eddard Stark. But be warned, if you confront the Queen or the Lannisters without proof, you risk them striking first. They won't hesitate to do what must be done to protect themselves. Perhaps you should gather more evidence, or perhaps you should do nothing. If you love your family, consider the safer path. Ned felt the old frustration well up. Honor demanded truth, demanded that Robert know. But cunning whispered that Baelish was right. Cersei would kill to protect her children, no matter their parentage. And if the realm believed these children were legitimate, removing them would mean a succession crisis. The Lannisters would not go quietly. Baelish bowed in a mocking way. I shall leave you to your thoughts. Should you require my expertise in such matters, you know where to find me. Good night, my lord. He slipped out, leaving Ned to wrestle with an impossible choice. Alone, Ned remembered the vow that had shaped his life, to protect Lyanna's child, to shield Jon Snow's identity from Robert. Now he was staring down another explosive secret, one that threatened the very monarchy Robert held. If Robert learned Joffrey was not his son, the king's fury would be boundless. War might break out between Baratheon and Lannister, ripping the realm apart. And if war erupted, who knew what dark corners might be searched, what hidden truths might be dredged up about Ned's own past. He closed his eyes and pictured Jon safe in Winterfell, for now. But how long would that safety last if all the land fell into civil strife? Ned felt trapped by honor and secrets, just as he had been at the Tower of Joy. He wondered how Ser Arthur Dayne would advise him. That man had chosen duty to Rhaegar's child over loyalty to a dying cause. In some twisted way, Ned had done the same, forging a silent alliance with Dayne to keep Jon alive. Could he now do anything less for the realm? A knock broke his thoughts. It was Arya, wide-eyed. Father, she said softly. I couldn't sleep. I heard voices. Is everything all right? Ned forced a gentle smile, motioning her inside. Everything is fine, little one. Sometimes I must speak with the king's advisors. Arya frowned, her face so candid. I don't like them. Varys scares me. And that Baelish man always has a funny smile. Ned chuckled without mirth. They are part of the court, whether we like them or not. He touched Arya's cheek, ushering her back to her bedchamber. Once she was settled, he lingered at her bedside a moment, watching her breathe. The memory of Lyanna flickered at the edges of his mind. Lyanna, so young, so brave, who had loved flowers and tourneys, who had run off with Rhaegar Targaryen and left the realm in flames. That tragedy had shaped everything. He bent and kissed Arya's brow, then retreated to his own lonely vigil. The next week passed in a tense hush. Ned tried to investigate discreetly, visiting the city's archives to look at lineages, speaking with the master of the king's stables about the color of Baratheon hair. Everywhere he looked, he found the same pattern: Baratheon's black of hair. The exception was Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen, all golden. More tidbits: the children's eyes, their features, a suspicious closeness between Jaime and Cersei. Yet every step Ned took, he felt watched. The gold cloaks of the City Watch seemed as likely to serve the Lannisters as the king. Meanwhile, Robert announced a grand tournament in Ned's honor, the new hand of the king. Throngs of small folk poured into the city, eager to see the spectacle. Ned tried to protest the expense, but Robert would hear none of it, laughing that a little debt didn't matter. "We're celebrating you, Ned," he roared, slapping Ned's back so hard it stung. The tournament began under a hot sun. Knights and freeriders from all corners of the realm entered the lists. Sansa watched from the stands, enthralled by the pageantry. Arya fidgeted, occasionally sneaking off to peer at the stables or practice with a wooden sword she had borrowed from a squire. Bran's eyes sparkled as he marveled at the shining armor, the thunder of hooves. Joffrey sat near Sansa, whispering grandiose promises. Ned felt uneasy throughout. Too many armed men, too many hidden agendas. The highlight of the day was the joust. Ser Gregor Clegane, the Mountain, unhorsed several challengers in brutal fashion. Ser Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, dazzled the crowd with his skill and beauty, besting Jaime Lannister in a surprising tilt. Robert cheered and drank, oblivious to the tensions below. Cersei's cool gaze flicked over the stands. Ned watched her warily. That evening, a crisis exploded. One of Robert's younger squires was found dead in an alley near the tourney grounds, a dagger in his back. Whispers flared that he had overheard something he shouldn't have. Some said it had to do with the Lannisters, others said it was a common mugging. Ned felt certain it was part of the hidden war swirling in the capital. The deeper he dug, the more bodies would turn up. He thought of his children, all vulnerable here in King's Landing. Perhaps Baelish's warning had merit. The safest course might be to remain silent. Yet Ned's conscience rebelled. To let Robert be deceived about his children was a betrayal. But if Ned confronted the king, Robert might spark a conflict that would tear the realm apart. And if the Lannisters discovered Ned knew, they might strike him down first or harm his family. In the midst of this dilemma, a raven arrived from Winterfell with a simple message. Jon Snow was ill with a fever, but recovering. Catelyn reported that the boy had overworked himself in the training yard and collapsed. The maester expected him to be fine, but the letter's tone was tense. Ned read it twice, relief warring with fresh worry. Jon was still so young. Exhausted, Ned retired late that night to his chambers. He unbuckled the dagger at his belt and laid it on a table. It was the same Valyrian steel dagger Robert had given him after the Greyjoy rebellion. He still remembered the weight of it, how it had saved his life once on a battlefield. He rubbed his eyes, sinking into a chair. His mind drifted to the Tower of Joy, that haunting memory. Arthur Dayne, the greatest knight Ned had ever faced. He had spared Dayne, forging an unspoken pact. "Take the child," Dayne had said. "Rhaegar's last hope. By all rights, that child should be heir to the Iron Throne." But Rhaegar's cause was destroyed, and Robert's hatred burned too hot. Ned had lied to keep Jon alive. Now, ironically, Robert himself was the victim of a different lie. His supposed heirs, fathered by another man. The ugly symmetry gnawed at Ned. He leaned forward, cradling his head in his hands. The burden of two secrets weighed him down. One that protected Jon Snow, one that endangered the realm. If he told Robert of the Lannister treachery, a war might begin. But perhaps it was the right war, the honest war. Yet how many innocents would die? Would the name Targaryen resurface in the midst of the chaos? Would someone unearth the truth of Jon's parentage amid the scramble for power? Ned's only guide was honor and the memory of Lyanna's plea. He prayed to the old gods for clarity, but in King's Landing, the old gods had no weirwood faces, and the Seven seemed distant. his duties as hand clamored for action. The realm needed stability. At last, he rose from the chair, determined. He would meet with Cersei privately, give her a chance to flee to avoid bloodshed. Perhaps if she took her children and left the city quietly, Robert need never know the depth of her betrayal. It was a risky plan, one that might cost Ned his life, but he saw no better way. He had to keep the realm from descending into madness. If the Lannisters refused, he would present the truth to Robert. Then the consequences would be on their heads. Ned would do what was necessary to protect the children from a slaughter like that inflicted on Rhaegar's heirs, even if it meant burning his own life to keep the peace. Ned arranged a secret meeting in the godswood of the Red Keep. Though no old gods dwelt there, the place was quiet enough for a private conversation. Under the pretense of solitude, he waited near a still pool, the moonlight turning the water silver. He had sent Cersei a note. "We must speak alone. Your children's future depends upon it." He did not sign it, but she would know. She arrived shrouded in a dark cloak. Her golden hair gleamed faintly. "Lord Stark," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "I trust you have a good reason for this." Ned studied her face, trying to see if any spark of remorse lingered there. He found only pride and guarded calculation. "I know the truth about Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen," he said quietly. Cersei's jaw tightened. Then she gave a slight shrug. "Oh? And what truth is that?" "Don't insult my intelligence," Ned said. "They are Jaime's children, not Robert's. Jon Arryn knew. He was killed for it. If Robert finds out, the realm will be plunged into war." She laughed softly, a harsh, mirthless sound. "And you, the honorable hand, you plan to tell him?" Ned took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I plan to give you a chance to take your children and leave the city before he returns from his hunt. I won't see them harmed. You can flee across the narrow sea, live out your days in exile, or find some other path. But if you remain, Robert will come to know, and he will kill them. He will kill you, Jaime. Anyone he sees as a threat to his name." For a moment, the Queen's composure cracked. Pain flickered across her face. Then it hardened again. "You think me so weak that I'd simply run away? You underestimate me, Stark. You know nothing of what a mother will do for her children." Ned pressed his lips together. "I know enough to see the bloodbath that will follow if you stay. The best I can do is offer you this chance. For the sake of your children, do not spit on it." Cersei held his gaze, and in that moment, the moonlight cast her face in a sculpture of ice and gold. "When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die," she said softly. "There is no middle ground. You are a fool to show me mercy, Stark." A cunning man would have gone straight to Robert with the truth and let him do the butchery. Ned closed his eyes briefly. "Perhaps I am a fool, but I'd rather be a living fool than watch more innocent children murdered." His mind conjured images of the Targaryen babes, Prince Aegon and Princess Rhaenys, slaughtered in the sack of King's Landing. He could still see the guilt etched in Tywin Lannister's legacy. "Take them and go. Do it soon. I will not stand in your way." She lifted her chin. "You speak of innocence and children, but you do not hesitate to brand mine as bastards." Her lips curled. "You are not the only one with secrets, Lord Stark." Ned stiffened. "Threaten me all you like, but you have no power to harm me beyond these walls." She smirked, as if at a private joke. "Don't I? I wonder. You have a bastard of your own, do you not? The boy you left in Winterfell, Jon Snow." The entire city whispers of Ned Stark's southern fling. "I never believed you the type. Now I suspect there's a far deeper story. Perhaps you are not so different from me, keeping secrets for the sake of a child." Ned's heart hammered in his chest. He struggled to keep his face calm. "Leave Jon out of this. He is no threat to you." Cersei studied him with an unsettling intensity. "Of course not, but secrets can be used to unmake men. There is a rumor, pure nonsense, I'm sure, that your bastard might have royal blood in his veins. After all, Rhaegar Targaryen was said to have fathered more than one child." Ned's blood ran cold. "You're grasping at shadows," he lied. "Do as you will. Her smile was razor-thin. "Your foolish mercy has given me fair warning. I will not run, Lord Stark, nor will I yield. I'll do whatever I must to keep my children safe. I suggest you do the same for yours." She turned and swept away, her cloak trailing across the damp grass. Ned stood there, lungs burning, trying to steady himself. She had heard whispers. How close had she come to the truth? Could she prove anything? No, not without more. But the possibility alone was terrifying. She might feed Robert's hatred, manipulate him into turning on Jon if it served her. If Ned threatened her brood's legitimacy, she might threaten Jon in return. He gazed at the silent pool, the reflection of the moon rippling. The Game of Thrones, indeed. It was a snare. He returned to his chambers and began drafting letters in haste. One to Catelyn, urging caution, telling her to be watchful, to keep Jon close and safe within Winterfell. Another to Howland Reed at Greywater Watch. He had not written to Howland in some time, but the man was one of the few who knew the truth. If Cersei or any other foe made a move, Ned wanted allies who understood what was truly at stake. Then he paused, quill trembling in his hand, thinking of Arthur Dayne in Starfall. It was madness to write to him, but if the secret of Jon's parentage was in danger, perhaps Dayne should know. In the end, Ned set the quill aside. He did not dare commit that to paper, not now. Perhaps if matters worsened. As dawn came, Ned sank onto his bed, exhausted. He had tried to do the honorable thing, to show mercy even to his enemies. Yet he feared he had only given them time to strike first. All he could do was pray that in the end, Robert would not react with the same mindless fury that had destroyed House Targaryen. He prayed for his children, for the realm, and for Jon Snow, the boy who carried a secret flame of dragon's blood. If the day of reckoning came, Ned Stark would face it with what resolve he could muster. But the shadows lengthened, and the wheels of fate turned with every breath. In Winterfell, unaware of the rising storm in King's Landing, Jon Snow stood atop the battlements, gazing out at the white expanse of snow-covered fields. Robb stood beside him, silent for once, while Theon Greyjoy lounged against the stone, arms folded. The morning light tinted the sky pale blue. Word had come that King Robert and Lord Stark had arrived safely in the capital, but the days that followed held no fresh news. Jon shifted his weight, feeling a slight ache in his limbs, left over from the fever he'd had last week. He was better now, but the memory of that sickness still lingered. "You sure you're well enough for training?" Robb asked, concern in his voice. Maester Luwin said to take it easy. Jon set his jaw. "I'm fine," he said, "just tired of lying in bed." It had been days of rest, days of forced stillness, and his mind had spun with questions about his mother, about his father's war. The more he asked, the fewer answers he got. Theon smirked. "If he's up here freezing with the rest of us, he's probably fine. Come on. Let's go see if Ser Roderick is awake to knock us about." He pushed off from the wall and headed down the steps. Robb followed, but Jon lingered a moment, glancing toward the south. He wished he knew what his father was doing, if he was all right. He wished he could have gone with him to serve, to see the city. Instead, he was stuck here, half lost in a web of unanswered questions. He pressed a hand to the cold stone parapet. "Mother, who were you?" he whispered, though the wind swallowed his words. For a moment he imagined a voice answering, but nothing came, only the stillness of the north. He closed his eyes and thought of the day he'd collapsed in the yard, pushing himself too hard in sword practice. He'd been desperate to prove himself, perhaps to become good enough that father might take him south. But it had only earned him a fevered delirium. He remembered fragments of that delirium, ghostly shapes, a woman's voice pleading, "Promise me, Ned." He had jolted awake to find Catelyn standing over him, an odd look in her eyes. Jon shook off the memory. He was strong enough now. He would train, become a sword his father could rely on. And one day, he would learn the truth of his mother, no matter how many stone walls stood in his path. With that resolve, he hurried down the steps to join Robb and Theon, the swirl of snow dancing behind him. Far away, in the southern courts, kings and queens might scheme, but here in Winterfell, Jon felt the cold clarity of the north in his veins. Winter was coming, and he would be ready for whatever followed. In King's Landing, the game of secrets hurtled toward a breaking point. Cersei Lannister, emboldened by Ned Stark's mercy, took steps of her own. She whispered poison in Robert's ear about the cost of the Hand's decisions, about rumors that Ned questioned the children's legitimacy. She subtly turned lords of the court against him, claiming the North was prideful and resentful of Lannister gold. Yet she did so with such care that Robert scarcely noticed, too busy hunting and feasting to focus on politics. Ned, unaware of how deeply Cersei had begun her countermoves, tried to gather proof of the children's parentage, hoping to confront Robert calmly with facts. He found himself blocked at every turn by Lannister men, who claimed to be following the king's orders. Letters from Catelyn in Winterfell were few and cautious. She hinted that tensions grew among the bannermen in his absence, that Jon Snow was restless, that watchers from the south occasionally came asking about the bastard boy. Ned's worry deepened daily. One fateful morning, Robert announced he was going on a boar hunt outside the city walls, accompanied by his brother Renly, some loyal knights, and plenty of wine. Ned urged caution. There had been talk of bandits or rabid boars in the region. But Robert laughed off the concerns, leaving the governance of the city to Ned in his capacity as Hand. While the king was gone, Ned discovered that Jaime Lannister had returned secretly from some mission. City watchmen loyal to the Lannisters started appearing near the Red Keep in greater numbers. Sensing a trap, Ned tried to send word to Robert about the children's parentage, but the messenger never returned. Fear clutched at him. He realized the time to act or flee was upon him, but his own sense of honor bound him to stand his ground. He would protect Sansa, Arya, and Bran, see them safely north if need be. That very night, a group of gold-cloaked guards marched into the Tower of the Hand. Their commander bore a royal decree for Ned to present himself in the throne room. Sansa and Arya were with him. He had no time to whisk them away. He had no choice but to comply. He arrived to find Queen Cersei seated on the Iron Throne, regally arrayed, Jaime Lannister at her side in gleaming armor. The hall was filled with courtiers, many wearing Lannister crimson. Varys stood to one side, face expressionless, and Baelish hovered near the foot of the throne, a faint smile on his lips. "Where is the king?" Ned demanded, striding forward, hand on the hilt of his sword. Arya and Sansa clung to him, alarmed. Cersei's voice rang out with theatrical sorrow. "Grievous news, Lord Stark. The king was wounded by a boar on his hunt and lingers near death. He may not last the night." Ned's heart lurched. Had it been arranged, or was it truly an accident? "I must see him," Ned said, ignoring the swords that bristled around the hall. "You will not," Cersei said coolly. "First, we must address your treason." "Treason?" Ned spat. "On whose authority?" "On mine," came another voice from the shadows. It was Peter Baelish stepping forward. "You sought to remove the Queen's children from the line of succession, whispering vile slanders about their parentage. That, my lord, is treason, and we have proof." A hush fell. Ned realized in horror that Baelish had turned on him fully, providing the Lannisters with whatever half-heard confessions or evidence they needed. He had played directly into their hands by trying to gather proof. Cersei produced a piece of parchment with a broken seal. Ned recognized it as a partial copy of the lineage notes he had compiled. Jaime Lannister smirked. "What was that you told my sister, Stark? Something about fleeing if you valued your life? You see, we have an excellent intelligence network." Ned drew himself up, placing an arm protectively around Sansa and Arya. "The king himself named me Hand of the King. I serve him, not you." Cersei gave a theatrical sigh. "When Robert dies, Joffrey will be king, and Joffrey has no place for traitors who question his blood. Guards, take Lord Stark's children to separate chambers. They mustn't be harmed, but they shall remain under our watch until their father answers for his crimes." Arya bristled. her hand drifting toward a small wooden practice sword at her belt. Sansa was wide-eyed, trembling. Ned quickly knelt to them, whispering, "Do not fight. Do as they say. I will protect you." His heart broke at the fear in their eyes. Guards seized them, leading them away, ignoring Arya's protests. Ned stood tall, though inside he felt dizzy. So this was how it ended. Trapped in the Red Keep, undone by his own honesty. He cursed himself for trusting Baelish, for underestimating Cersei's ruthlessness. "I came here to do my duty," he said quietly. "And you did?" Cersei said in a tone of mock sympathy. "Take him. We will await the king's final decree. If he recovers, perhaps we can show mercy." Ned's men, outnumbered by gold cloaks, had no chance to resist. They were disarmed. Ned was forced to his knees, his sword wrenched from his grip. Jaime Lannister loomed above him, his arrogant face twisted in triumph. "I'd guard your tongue if I were you, Stark. The next words you speak could be your last." Ned swallowed his rage, thinking only of his children, and beyond that, of Jon Snow in the distant north. He had to survive somehow for their sakes. As the guards hauled him away to a cell in the dungeons, he vowed he would protect them, even if it meant bending his honor. Once again, he found himself a captive of secrets. Secrets that threatened the entire realm, secrets that threatened to shatter House Stark. The memory of the Tower of Joy rose in his mind, unbidden. Lyanna's dying face and Arthur Dayne's promise. If only he had the Sword of the Morning by his side now. But he was alone, locked in a cage of stone. Deep below the Red Keep, in a dim cell, Ned Stark sank onto a cold bench, pain lancing his old wounds. He closed his eyes and listened to the slow drip of water somewhere in the darkness. He prayed the king might yet recover, but he suspected Cersei had ensured Robert's demise. The realm stood on the brink of war, and Jon Snow, the true child of Rhaegar Targaryen, remained hidden in Winterfell, unknowing of the storms to come. The wheel of fate turned, grinding all beneath it. In the hush of that dungeon, Ned whispered a final prayer to the old gods, clinging to the last shreds of hope. He would endure. He must. For the living, for his children, for the promise he had made so long ago to a dying sister in a lonely tower.